You're listening to the free ad-sponsored re-release of American Election's Wicked Game, a weekly march through every presidential election from 1789 to 2024. To listen to all episodes right now, ad-free, go to intohistory.com. Subscribers there enjoy ad-free listening, early access, bonus content, and more from a growing collection of great history podcasts. Start your free trial today at intohistory.com. It's the evening of Friday, January 27th, 2017 at the White House, 7 days after Donald Trump's inauguration. FBI Director James Comey stands in the doorway of the green room with a lump in his throat. He's nervous. When President Trump called earlier today and invited him to dinner, Comey assumed there'd be other guests. But inside the green room, all Comey sees is a table set for two. Comey is in charge of a criminal investigation into whether Trump's campaign colluded with the Russian government to interfere in the 2016 election, which means this one-on-one dinner with the president is likely to be awkward. At precisely 6:30 p.m., Trump arrives and sees Comey standing in the doorway. I like that. I like people who are on time. I think a leader should always be on time. Trump gestures to the table, and the two men sit down for dinner. Not long into their meal, Trump asks a sudden and blunt question. So, what do you want to do? The question catches Comey off guard. He's not entirely sure what the president means. Before he processes how to respond, Trump launches into a monologue. See, lots of people want to be the FBI director, but I think very highly of you, very highly. I've heard great things about you, and I know the people at the FBI think very highly of you too. But I understand if you want to walk away, given everything you've been through. Of course, if you walk away, that's bad, because it might look like you did something wrong. I know I can make a change at the FBI if I want to, but I want to know what you think. When Comey finally gets a chance to respond, he chooses his words carefully. Mr. President, you can, of course, fire the FBI director anytime you wish. Well, I want to stay and do the job. I love the job. I find the job extremely rewarding, and I'd like to finish out my term. You can count on me to always tell you the truth. I don't do sneaky things. I don't leak. But I'm not on anybody's side politically. And this is in your best interests, Mr. President. The FBI is able to do the work we do credibly because it is not seen as a tool of the president. Trump doesn't seem satisfied with the answer. And so a bit later, he presses the issue again. Well, you see, I need loyalty. I expect loyalty. Comey barely moves a muscle as Trump launches into another monologue. This time about the FBI's 2016 investigation into then-candidate Hillary Clinton's use of a private email server. With the Clinton investigation, there were three Comeys. Comey 1 saved her ass by announcing you wouldn't prosecute. Comey 2 did what he had to do when he reopened the investigation. Comey 3 saved her again with that letter you sent to Congress, but she totally misplayed that. Trump winds his way through a myriad of topics, from Clinton to President Obama, before circling back to the matter at hand. I need loyalty. Again, Comey chooses his words carefully. You will always get honesty from me. Well, that's what I want, honest loyalty. You will get that from me. In his book, A Higher Loyalty, James Comey described his dinner with President Trump as surreal. He wrote, "The President of the United States had invited me to dinner and decided my job security was on the menu." Several months later, on May 9, 2017, Trump fired James Comey. As the New York Times reported, the stunning development in Mr. Trump's presidency raised the specter of political interference by a sitting president into an existing investigation by the nation's leading law enforcement agency. It immediately ignited Democratic calls for a special counsel to lead the Russia inquiry. And on May 17th, the Justice Department did appoint former FBI Director Robert Mueller as special counsel. His mandate was to oversee the FBI investigation of Russian efforts to influence the 2016 presidential election and related matters. Though Trump repeatedly called the Russia investigation a witch hunt and a hoax, Mueller's special counsel office produced 37 indictments and 7 guilty pleas or convictions. Along the way, Trump associates repeatedly lied to investigators about their contacts with Russians. Though Mueller did provide evidence for obstruction in his report, he failed to prove any direct coordination between the president and the Russians. Mueller also declined to subpoena Trump's testimony or to recommend criminal charges against him. Still, as Newsweek reported, over 1,000 former federal prosecutors concluded that if President Trump was any other citizen, he would have been charged with obstruction of justice. The 448-page Mueller report concluded that the Russians interfered in the 2016 presidential election in sweeping and systematic fashion. But President Trump refused to accept this as fact. Trump's desire to prove otherwise would place his presidency in peril and would set the table for the unprecedented election of 2020. From Airship, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is American Elections Wicked Game. The 2020 election officially began on January 20th, 2017, when President Donald Trump filed for re-election on his first day in office. It didn't take long for a slew of over 25 Democratic challengers to enter the race. Congressional representatives, senators, authors, and business leaders from across the country comprised the most diverse primary field in American history. There were 6 women: Senators Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar, and Kirsten Gillibrand, Hawaii Congressman Tulsi Gabbard, and author Marianne Williamson. There were 2 black candidates, New Jersey Senator Cory Booker and Senator Kamala Harris, the daughter of Indian and Jamaican immigrants. Additionally, there is Julian Castro, a Latino cabinet secretary under President Obama, tech entrepreneur Andrew Yang, the first Taiwanese-American hopeful, and South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg, the first openly gay presidential candidate. But out of the crowded field, there was an apparent frontrunner: President Obama's Vice President Joe Biden, a career politician with nearly 40 years of experience in the Senate and several prior runs for president. But at the first Democratic primary debate in late June of 2019, Biden's record was under fire. As the New York Times reported, Biden was forceful in pushing back on criticism of his record. Those attacks included a call for the 76-year-old former vice president to pass the torch to a younger generation, as well as questions about his positions on various issues. The debate revealed a divide between the old guard and the new, and between the moderate and progressive wings of the Democratic Party, a rift that had been on full display in the 2016 election when Hillary Clinton faced off against progressive candidate Bernie Sanders. Clinton had prevailed in the 2016 Democratic primary, but many Bernie Sanders supporters felt the Democratic Party had given preferential treatment to Clinton. By some estimates, 10% of Sanders voters ended up voting for Donald Trump. Those votes may have made an impact in key battleground states where the election was ultimately decided. And during the first primary debate of the 2020 contest, that same ideological divide was alive and well. As the New York Times reported, at a moment when President Trump has inflamed the country's racial divisions, the clash also went to the heart of the Democrats' debate over whom to nominate. Should they put forward a moderate who could appeal to some of the white voters who elected Mr. Trump, but who also carries baggage from an earlier political era? Or would they be more likely to win by energizing younger and non-white voters with a candidate like Ms. Harris? But according to an Emerson College poll, it seemed many Democrats had made up their mind. After the first debate, Biden extended his lead from 7 to 15 points. This was troubling news to many progressive Democrats and to incumbent President Donald J. Trump. This is episode 59, 2020 Biden versus Trump, the soul of America. According to reporting by CNBC, at a private meeting in March, Trump seemed concerned about the prospect of facing Joe Biden. So the Trump campaign began looking for dirt on Obama's former VP. They would hone in on a story surrounding a Ukrainian oil and gas company called Burisma. In May of 2019, the New York Times published an article with the headline, "Biden Faces Conflict of Interest Questions That Are Being Promoted by Trump and Allies." Back in 2015, as part of his White House duties, then Vice President Joe Biden had gone after corruption in the Ukrainian government. According to reporting by the New York Times, on a trip to Kiev in December 2015, Biden threatened to withhold $1 billion in United States loan guarantees if Ukraine's leaders did not dismiss the country's top prosecutor, who had been accused of turning a blind eye to corruption. It seemed Biden's efforts worked. Months later, the Ukrainian parliament had voted out the corrupt prosecutor general. But the story didn't end there. The Times also reported among those who had a stake in the outcome was Hunter Biden, Mr. Biden's younger son, who was at the time on the board of Burisma, an energy company owned by a Ukrainian oligarch who had been in the sights of the fired prosecutor general. To many Americans, this fact was suspicious, as was Hunter Biden's presence on the board and his $50,000 a month salary. Though Hunter Biden had gone to law school at Yale and served on the board of multiple nonprofits, he had no direct experience in Ukraine. He also had a history of drug use, leaving many to wonder if the only reason Hunter Biden was offered the position in the first place was because of his powerful and well-connected father. The Biden campaign continually denied any conflict of interest, insisting that as vice president, Joe Biden had only carried out U.S. foreign policy in Ukraine. Hunter Biden, too, continually dismissed the idea of any impropriety. But Trump and his allies didn't let the story go. In an interview with Fox News in May of 2019, Trump had said, "Look at Joe Biden. He calls Ukrainian government leaders and says, 'Don't you dare prosecute. If you don't fire this prosecutor, we're not giving you $2 billion in loan guarantees,' or whatever he was supposed to give. Can you imagine if I did that?" In a May interview with the New York Times, Donald Trump's personal lawyer, former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani, had threatened to go to Ukraine to pressure Ukrainian leaders to reopen the investigation into Hunter Biden. Shortly after Giuliani's interview, Yuri Lutsenko, then prosecutor general in Ukraine, cleared both Bidens of wrongdoing. But Trump and his allies did not accept this outcome either. In July of 2019, Trump took matters into his own hands. It's just after 9 a.m. on July 25th, 2019 at the White House residence. President Donald Trump is on the phone with newly elected Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. "Congratulations on a great victory. We all watched from the United States, and you did a terrific job. The way you came from behind, somebody who wasn't given much of a chance, you ended up winning easily. Congratulations." "Thank you, Mr. President." Trump has called Zelensky to congratulate him on his party's recent victory in the Ukrainian parliament, as well as his previous victory in the Ukrainian presidential election back in April. Not long into the phone call, Zelensky, a former comedian, makes a joke. "I think I should run more often, so you can call me more often, and we can talk over the phone more often." Now, that's a very good idea. "Well, yes, to tell you the truth, we are trying to work hard because we wanted to drain the swamp here in our country." Drain the swamp was one of President Trump's campaign promises in 2016, a reference to Trump's stated mission to root out corruption in Washington. But Trump and Zelensky have more in common than a shared slogan. Trump is a former reality star, Zelensky a former entertainer. Both are political outsiders promising change. And Zelensky knows that to deliver, he will need Trump's help. "I would also like to thank you for your great support in the area of defense. We are ready to continue to cooperate for the next steps. Specifically, we are almost ready to buy more Javelins from the United States." The Javelin is a shoulder-fired precision missile system designed to destroy tanks, armored vehicles, and helicopters. These missiles are essential to Ukraine's ongoing fight against Russian-backed separatists in eastern Ukraine. In response to Zelensky's comment about Javelin missiles, Trump brings up a subject of critical importance to his re-election campaign. "I would like you to do us a favor, though, because our country has been through a lot, and Ukraine knows a lot about it." The day prior, former special counsel Robert Mueller testified before Congress about his investigation into Russian meddling in the 2016 election. Many Democrats claim Mueller's testimony proved collusion between Russia and the Trump campaign. But Trump has consistently dismissed the idea, repeatedly asserting there was no collusion. And minutes before this phone call, Trump fired off a series of tweets claiming that Mueller's testimony was complete vindication. As you saw yesterday, that whole nonsense ended with a very poor performance by a man named Robert Mueller, an incompetent performance. But they say a lot of it started with Ukraine. Whatever you can do, it's very important that you do it if that's possible. "Yes. For me as a president, it is very important, and we are open for any future cooperation." United States intelligence agencies unanimously agree Russia was behind the election interference efforts of 2016. But Trump disagrees. Trump believes a theory that Ukraine, and not Russia, was responsible for the 2016 hacks into the Democratic National Committee. So in the middle of the conversation about meddling, Trump brings up another subject. "There's a lot of talk about Joe Biden's son. that Biden stopped the prosecution of his son Hunter. And a lot of people want to find out about that, so whatever you can do would be great. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution, so if you can look into it, sounds horrible to me. I wanted to tell you about the prosecutor. First off, I understand, and I'm knowledgeable about the situation. Since we've won, and we have the absolute majority, the next prosecutor general will be 100% my person, my candidate. He or she will look into the situation. Zelensky then steers the conversation to another matter. The current U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch. I would kindly ask if you have any additional information that you can provide to us. It would be very helpful for the investigation to make sure that we administer justice with regard to the ambassador to Ukraine from the United States. As far as I recall, her name was Ivanovich. It was great that you told me she was a bad ambassador because I agree with you 100%. Her attitude towards me was far from the best, as she admired the previous president and she was on his side. She would not accept me as a new president well enough. Well, she's going to go through some things. I'll have Mr. Giuliani give you a call, and I'm also going to have Attorney General Barr call, and we will get to the bottom of it. As Deb Reichman of the AP News wrote, there were dozens of ears listening to President Donald Trump's 30-minute phone call with the leader of Ukraine. White House staffers working in the secure, soundproof Situation Room in the West Wing basement listened in and chronicled the conversation. Members of the National Security Staff edited a memo written about the call, and White House lawyers directed the memo to be uploaded into a highly restricted classified computer network. But that memo wouldn't remain a secret forever. The truth would eventually come to light, and the infamous Zelensky call would put Trump's presidency in the political sights of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. In August of 2018, 11 months before the Zelensky call, Trump had signed an agreement to give Ukraine $250 million in aid. 1 year later, in August of 2019, reports in the press indicated that Trump had delayed giving the aid. Trump officials claimed the purpose of the delay was to give the president a chance to review the funding program. But many Democrats suspected Trump was withholding the aid in an attempt to pressure President Zelensky to reopen the investigation into Hunter Biden. In the 2018 midterm elections, the Republicans had maintained control of the Senate, but the Democrats had taken back the House, which gave them the power of oversight and the power to investigate. On September 9th, just as House Democrats began an investigation into Rudy Giuliani's activities in Ukraine, a whistleblower came forward. In an official complaint, the whistleblower, an unnamed CIA officer, wrote, "In the days following the Zelensky phone call, I learned from multiple U.S. officials that senior White House officials had intervened to lock down all the records of the phone call, especially the word-for-word transcript of the call. This set of actions underscored to me that White House officials understood the gravity of what had transpired in the call." The whistleblower complaint ignited a political firestorm in Washington. By the end of September, the story of the call was public knowledge, and it dominated the headlines. Democrats alleged a quid pro quo. And though Trump forcefully denied it, on September 23rd, the president seemed to incriminate himself. As NBC News reported, Trump told reporters that he tied vital funding for Ukraine to that country's handling of corruption, which he has alleged Vice President Joe Biden's family was engaged in there. The next day, on September 24th, Democratic Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi announced an impeachment inquiry into President Donald Trump. She said, "The president must be held accountable. No one is above the law." Pelosi's announcement kick-started a process that threatened Trump's presidency with the specter of a formal impeachment proceeding and potentially an impeachment trial in the Senate. In late September, as the AP reported, the whistleblower's official complaint alleges a concerted White House effort to suppress the transcript of the call and describes a shadow campaign of foreign policy efforts by the president's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, that unnerved some senior administration officials who felt he was circumventing normal channels. Trump was livid. In audio released by the Los Angeles Times in late September, Trump vented his frustrations at a private event in New York.
But basically, that person never saw the report, never saw the call, meaning never saw the call, heard something, and decided that he or she, whoever the hell it is, sort of like almost a spy. I want to know who's the person that gave the whistleblower, who's the person that gave the whistleblower the information, because that's close to a spy. You know what we used to do in the old days when we were smart, right? With spies and treason. We used to handle it a little differently than we do now.
October 2019 was an all-out political war in Washington. As the combined Intelligence Oversight and Foreign Affairs Committees went to work on the impeachment inquiry, Trump's White House went to work blocking their efforts. As the New York Times would later characterize it, Mr. Trump directed a campaign to stonewall the House impeachment inquiry, barring testimony from some of his closest advisors and refusing to provide any documents. Trump continually insisted that there was no quid pro quo, but on October 17th, Mick Mulvaney, the acting White House chief of staff, seemed to undermine Trump's position. According to reporting by the Washington Post, acting White House chief of staff Mick Mulvaney said at a news conference Thursday that President Trump withheld nearly $400 million in military aid in part to pressure Ukraine to pursue an investigation that could benefit him politically, acknowledging before the nation a quid pro quo that is at the heart of an impeachment inquiry and that the president and his allies have vigorously denied for weeks. Mulvaney would later walk back his remarks, insisting that there was absolutely no quid pro quo between Ukrainian aid and an investigation of the 2016 election. The White House attempted to prove in court that the impeachment inquiry was illegitimate, but those efforts failed on October 25th when a federal judge affirmed the legality of the probe. The judge also forced the White House to turn over evidence to the House of Representatives. In the end, the White House's attempts to impede the impeachment proceedings came up short. Even as the State Department ordered its employees not to cooperate with the House's inquiry, one by one government officials came forward and testified. Among them, Ukraine Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch, who testified that she felt personally threatened by Trump's suggestion to Ukrainian President Zelensky that she was going to go through some things. More public hearings were set to begin in November of 2019, and the threat of impeachment would hang over much of the remainder of Trump's term and be a rallying cry for his Democratic competitors. In the run-up to the 2020 contest, the progressive and moderate factions of the Democratic Party were divided over a host of issues, most notably health care. Progressive candidates like Senator Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren pushed for universal health care or Medicare for all. Moderate candidates like former Vice President Joe Biden and former Mayor Pete Buttigieg advocated for a public option, or as Mayor Pete called it, Medicare for all who want it. A few of the Democratic hopefuls, like Senator Kamala Harris, landed somewhere in the middle, proposing Medicare for all with a role for private insurance. But if there was one issue that loomed larger than health care on the primary debate stage, it was the question of impeachment. The fourth Democratic debate took place on October 15, 2019, in Westerville, Ohio. A dozen candidates participated. But it was Joe Biden who stole the spotlight when moderator Anderson Cooper of CNN pressed him on a controversial topic.
Thank you, Congressman. The impeachment inquiry is centered on President Trump's attempts to get political dirt from Ukraine on Vice President Biden and his son Hunter. Mr. Vice President, President Trump has falsely accused your son of doing something wrong while serving on a company board in Ukraine. I want to point out there's no evidence of wrongdoing by either one of you. Having said that, on Sunday, you announced that if you're president, no one in your family or associated with you will be involved in any foreign businesses. My question is, if it's not okay for a president's family to be involved in foreign businesses, why was it okay for your son when you were vice president? Vice President Biden?
Look, my son did nothing wrong. I did nothing wrong. I carried out the policy of the United States government in rooting out corruption in Ukraine. And that's what we should be focusing on. And what I wanted to make a point about, and my son's statement speaks for itself. He spoke about it today. My son's statement speaks for itself. What I think is important is we focus on why it's so important to remove this man from office. On the 17th, look, the fact that George Washington worried on the first time he spoke after being elected president that what we had to worry about is foreign interference in our elections. It was the greatest threat to America. This president, on three occasions, has invited foreign governments and heads of government to get engaged in trying to alter our elections. The fact is that it is outrageous. Rudy Giuliani, the president, and his thugs have already proven that they, in fact, are flat lying. What we have to do now is focus on Donald Trump. He doesn't want me to be the candidate. He's going after me because he knows if I get the nomination, I will beat him like a drum.
In November, at the fifth debate in Atlanta, impeachment again dominated the conversation. But it was arguably Bernie Sanders who made the biggest impact when moderator Rachel Maddow asked him about Trump's actions.
Well, Rachel, sadly, we have a president who is not only a pathological liar, he is likely the most corrupt president in the modern history of America. But we cannot simply be consumed by Donald Trump. Because if we are, you know what? We're going to lose the election. Right now, you got 87 million people who have no health insurance or are underinsured. We're facing the great existential crisis of our time in terms of climate change. You got 500,000 people sleeping out on the street, and you got 18 million people paying half of their limited incomes for housing. What the American people understand is that the Congress can walk and chew bubble gum at the same time. In other words, we can deal with Trump's corruption, but we also have to stand up for the working families of this country.
The Democrats would indeed have to walk and chew gum. On December 18, 2019, the House of Representatives approved 2 articles of impeachment for abuse of power and for obstruction of Congress, making Trump only the 3rd president impeached in American history. 2 days later, a concerned Trump put in a call to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell of Kentucky. McConnell told him, "You are getting a lot of advice, Mr. President. I know the Senate better than any of those people you're talking to, and I know how to make my members feel comfortable. The only thing that matters is the final vote." McConnell vowed to get all 53 Republican senators to vote for Trump's acquittal, telling the president, "I need to know that you trust me to run this." In the 2016 presidential contest, Trump had made appointing conservative judges a centerpiece of his campaign, and Mitch McConnell had helped him deliver. Back in February of 2016, when conservative Judge Antonin Scalia, a longtime Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, died, McConnell issued a statement. The American people should have a voice in the selection of their next Supreme Court justice. Therefore, this vacancy should not be filled until we have a new president. Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution mandates that the president shall nominate and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate shall appoint judges of the Supreme Court. Democrats had accused McConnell and the Republicans of playing dirty politics by denying President Obama his constitutional right. But McConnell's maneuvers had worked. President Obama had nominated a highly respected moderate judge named Merrick Garland. McConnell had refused to hold hearings, clearing the way for President Trump to nominate Neil Gorsuch, a conservative federal appeals justice from Colorado. Then, when Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy had retired in the summer of 2018, McConnell had again succeeded in pushing through the confirmation of Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, even as Kavanaugh faced accusations of sexual assault. McConnell had helped Trump confirm nearly 200 conservative federal court judges, prompting Trump to say, "Generations from now, Americans will know that Mitch McConnell helped save the constitutional rule of law in America." The Trump-McConnell team had worked well to fill the judiciary with conservative judges, and it looked like Mitch McConnell would continue to support the president in the Senate impeachment hearings. But Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats were gearing up for a fight in the Senate. The impeachment trial there was set to begin in mid-January 2020. But as the eyes of the nation turned to Capitol Hill, from overseas came a looming threat to the safety of the American people and Donald Trump's prospects for a second term.
Kroger Delivery has one mission: to deliver the freshest food right to your door. That's why our drivers are pros. Our trucks are refrigerated. And when it comes to low prices, we always deliver. With $20 off your first order of $75 or more, there's no better time to get in on the action. Mission accomplished. Restrictions apply. See site for details.
Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at IntoHistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also ad-free, like Her Half of History. Because even though Hillary Clinton may not have made history when she ran for president in 2016, there have always been women who seized power, spied for their country, created artistic masterpieces, even escaped slavery. Her Half of History is perfect for all those who sat in history class and wondered, what were the women doing all this time? Because the answer is a lot. Get Her Half of History, Wicked Game, and many others ad-free at IntoHistory.com. Subscribe now at IntoHistory.com. It's January 28, 2020 in Washington. President Donald Trump sits behind the resolute desk in the Oval Office. The room is filled with high-level government officials who've gathered for the PDB, or the Presidential Daily Briefing, a top-secret rundown of the most important issues of the day. 12 days ago, the impeachment trial of President Trump began in the Senate. But today, the briefing is dominated by a different kind of threat, a mysterious virus overseas. Beth Sanner, an intelligence briefer, has the floor. China is worried, Mr. President, but the intelligence community is keeping an eye on the situation. What are you hearing? As far as we can tell, it's nothing close to the severity of the 2003 SARS outbreak. That's good news. But not everyone in the room agrees with Sanner's assessment. One of them is Matt Pottinger, the Deputy National Security Advisor. He's been on the NSC staff for 3 years. He lived in China for nearly a decade. He was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal during the SARS outbreak, and Trump knows Pottinger. He trusts him. Well, what do you know? Well, sir, for the past few days, I've been on the phone with my contacts in China. These are serious people, Mr. President. They know the science. I asked one of them if they think this is going to be as bad as SARS in 03. What did he say? Don't think SARS 03. Think influenza pandemic 1918. During the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, 1/3 of the world's population was infected. 40 to 50 million died worldwide, including 675,000 Americans. Pottinger's words nearly sucked the air out of the room. Why do you think this will be worse than 03? It's a 3-alarm fire, sir. For one thing, contrary to the reports from the Chinese government, people are getting this disease from other people, not just from animals. Additionally, a significant portion of the people spreading the disease show no symptoms. How many? My best source there tells me that as many as 50% of the infected population are asymptomatic. And sir, the disease has traveled far outside of Wuhan. They shut Wuhan down. They cut off travel inside China, but they haven't cut it off to the rest of the world, which means it's highly likely the disease is already here. What do we do about it? There's only one thing to do, sir. Cut off travel from China to the U.S. Do it now, Mr. President. Not long after the January 28th meeting, Trump imposed travel restrictions on China, a move that undoubtedly saved American lives. But in public, Trump often downplayed the virus, telling the nation it was no worse than a seasonal flu and predicting it would soon disappear like a miracle. Bob Woodward, the renowned investigative journalist, would later write, Trump's public attention was focused on just about everything except the novel coronavirus. Trump was preoccupied with his impeachment, a proceeding he had repeatedly called a hoax. On February 5, 2020, after 5 months of hearings and investigations, the impeachment process finally came to an end. To many on both sides of the aisle, the Senate trial had been a sham. Many Democrats pointed to the fact that Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and Senate Republicans had refused to call witnesses or hear new evidence. Many Republicans continued to assert Trump's suggestion that the trial was part of a Democratic witch hunt to undo the results of the 2016 election. In the end, every Senate Democrat voted guilty on both charges. Every Republican voted not guilty on the charge of obstruction. Only one Republican voted guilty on the charge of abuse of power, Utah Senator and 2012 Republican presidential nominee Mitt Romney. The next day, at the National Prayer Breakfast in Washington, Trump held up a copy of USA Today, and to the sounds of raucous applause from his supporters, he showed the crowd the headline, "Acquitted." The 2020 Democratic primaries got off to an unexpected start at the Iowa caucus in early February. In what many saw as a two-way race between frontrunner Joe Biden and progressive champion Bernie Sanders, a third candidate declared victory, former South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg. A former Rhodes Scholar and Navy intelligence officer, Buttigieg's victory came as a surprise, but it was the momentum behind Bernie Sanders that gave many moderate Democrats pause. 8 days after the Iowa caucus, Sanders won first place at the New Hampshire primary with 25.6% of the vote. Buttigieg came in a close second. Biden came in fifth, behind Senators Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar. As Politico reported, shell-shocked by 2 big losses, Joe Biden's presidential campaign tried to reassure donors, surrogates, and the press about his path forward. Cedric Richmond, the co-chair of Biden's campaign, gave a stern warning. Elected officials across the country understand there will be down-ballot carnage to the Democratic Party if we elect the wrong person. If Bernie Sanders were atop the ticket, we would be in jeopardy of losing the House. We would not win the Senate back. Still, the political wind seemed to be at Bernie's back. On February 22nd, he won the Nevada caucus and, in the minds of many, claimed frontrunner status over Joe Biden. But the Biden campaign was quietly confident. Joe Biden had gambled his nomination on black voters, turning out in droves to support him at the South Carolina primary in late February. And even though the poll showed Biden's lead in the state dwindling, Biden's gamble paid off. The explanation for Biden's stunning victory in South Carolina can be summed up in the simple slogan, South Carolina knows Joe. Jamie Lovegrove of South Carolina's Post and Courier explained the meaning behind that slogan. Back in 1972, South Carolina's longtime U.S. Senator Fritz Hollings persuaded Biden to continue with his political career after his wife and daughter died in a car accident, and the two became dear friends until the day Hollings died last year. Hollings often brought Biden down to South Carolina to speak at political events, vacation, and introduce him to many of the movers and shakers of South Carolina Democratic politics that stood with him all the way through his 2020 campaign. One of those movers and shakers was the man they called the South Carolina Kingmaker, Congressman Jim Clyburn, South Carolina's most powerful Democrat. With Clyburn's endorsement and with the support of nearly 2/3 of South Carolina's black voters, Biden won with 48.4% of the vote. Sanders came in second with not even 20%. After South Carolina, the field got smaller as the moderate wing of the party coalesced around Biden. On March 2nd, days before Super Tuesday, 3 popular moderate candidates, Pete Buttigieg, Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar, and former Texas Congressman Beto O'Rourke, all endorsed Joe Biden. Then, on Super Tuesday, Biden won 10 of the 14 states. His popularity, especially with black voters, helped him win a string of victories across the South, including the delegate-rich state of Texas. Sanders would stay in the race until April, but for the Bernie Sanders campaign, Super Tuesday was the beginning of the end. And for the American people, the month of March would bring unwelcome and life-altering news. Back in January of 2020, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC, had confirmed the first U.S. case of COVID-19, the disease caused by a new strain of coronavirus. The Washington state resident had recently traveled from Wuhan, the epicenter of a severe outbreak in China. The following month, the Trump administration had declared a public health emergency due to the coronavirus outbreak, and in response, the stock market began to plummet. In China, the death toll quickly surpassed the 2003 SARS outbreak. But in the U.S., the nation was not drastically impacted until March 6th, when 21 passengers on a California cruise ship tested positive for the virus that causes COVID-19. On March 11th, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic. 2 days later, President Trump declared a national emergency. On March 17th, the U.S. reported its 100th death from the virus. 2 days later, California issued a statewide stay-at-home order. By the end of the month, just as the U.S. hit 1,000 deaths and over 80,000 cases, Congress passed and Trump signed the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. The CARES Act, as it was called, injected $2 trillion in aid into the economy as governors across the country put stay-at-home orders in place. By the end of April, over 25 million Americans had filed for unemployment, and by late May, the U.S. had more than 1.6 million cases and more than 100,000 deaths, a far higher death count than any other nation in the world. But even as death cases spiked, President Trump repeatedly downplayed the severity of the virus. He would not take responsibility, repeatedly blaming the outbreak on China. According to the Washington Post, Trump downplayed the severity of the coronavirus 31 times in the first 3 months of 2020. He had also gone so far as to call the Democrats' criticism of his response to the virus their new hoax. Trump would repeatedly rail against stay-at-home orders, even as his own experts recommended them. Then, on April 17th, Trump fired off a series of tweets: "Liberate Minnesota, liberate Michigan, and liberate Virginia." As the Detroit News reported, all 3 states have Democratic governors, and all 3 governors have faced criticism for actions they've taken to combat COVID-19. Trump's tweets happened concurrently with anti-stay-at-home protests in Minnesota and Michigan. Additionally, Trump was inconsistent in his public position on the question of masks. At a White House briefing in April, Trump said, "With the masks, it's going to be a really voluntary thing. You can do it. You don't have to do it. I'm choosing not to do it, but some people might want to do it, and that's okay. As I greet presidents, prime ministers, dictators, kings, queens, I don't see it for myself. I just don't." But in May, the White House instituted a mask rule in the West Wing. Still, the same day, Trump appeared at a press briefing without one. Even as his own experts urged Americans to wear them, Trump's press secretary insisted that masks were a CDC recommendation, not a requirement, and that a mask was a personal choice. Trump himself would not wear a mask in public until July. But in the summer of 2020, Trump's response to COVID-19 was not the only issue dominating the headlines. On May 25, 2020, a Minneapolis police officer placed his knee on the neck of an unarmed 46-year-old black man and held it there for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. The incident was recorded, and after the video of George Floyd's killing surfaced, angry protests erupted in more than 2,000 cities all across the country, something many Americans had not seen since the civil rights movement in the Vietnam War. The majority of the protests against police brutality were nonviolent, but the news often showed images of rioting, looting, and buildings set ablaze. On May 31st, 6 days after the killing of George Floyd, a fire broke out at St. John's Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C., also known as the Church of the Presidents. In response, the D.C. mayor instituted a curfew that was set to start the following day on June 1st at 7 p.m. That same day, hundreds of peaceful protesters defied the curfew and gathered in the Lafayette Park area near St. John's and the White House. Later that night, in an incident recorded on video, officers in riot gear rushed the protesters using flashbang devices, smoke bombs, rubber bullets, and pepper spray to clear the area. Not long after the violent exchange began, Trump made a speech in the Rose Garden at the White House.
Thank you very much. My fellow Americans, my first and highest duty as president is to defend our great country and the American people. I swore an oath to uphold the laws of our nation, and that is exactly what I will do. All Americans were rightly sickened and revolted by the brutal death of George Floyd. My administration is fully committed that for George and his family, justice will be served. He will not have died in vain. But we cannot allow the righteous cries and peaceful protesters to be drowned out by an angry mob. The biggest victims of the rioting are peace-loving citizens in our poorest communities. And as their president, I will fight to keep them safe. I will fight to protect you. I am your president of law and order and an ally of all peaceful protesters.
Then, at around 7 p.m. after his Rose Garden speech, Trump and a group of advisors left the White House, walked the 1,000 feet to St. John's, held up a Bible, and posed for the press. Later that night, 2 D.C. Army National Guard helicopters were deployed to disperse what remained of the crowd that had gathered earlier that day. Flying as low as 45 feet, snapping tree limbs, and throwing dust and broken glass in the air. The next day, on June 2nd, presumptive Democratic nominee Joe Biden addressed the nation from City Hall in Philadelphia and gave a speech that many would call the defining moment of his campaign.
Mr. Mayor, thanks for your hospitality. And to all the elected officials that are here, I bring you greetings. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. George Floyd's last words, but they didn't die with him. They're still being heard, echoing all across this nation. They speak to a nation where, too often, just the color of your skin puts your life at risk. They speak to a nation where more than 100,000 people have lost their lives to the virus and 40 million have filed for unemployment, with a disproportionate number of those deaths and job losses concentrated in Black and brown communities. And they speak to a nation where every day millions of people, millions, not at the moment of losing their life, but in the course of living their life, are saying to themselves, I can't breathe. It's a wake-up call to our nation, in my view. It's for all of us. and I mean all of us. The president held up the Bible at St. John's Church yesterday. I just wish he opened it once in a while instead of brandishing it. If he opened it, he could have learned something. They're all called to love one another as we love ourselves. It's really hard work, but it's the work of America. Donald Trump is interested in doing that work.
By mid-June, as many as 21 million adults had attended a Black Lives Matter or police brutality protest. In August, CNN's Elliot McLaughlin wrote, "White and black interests converge today for many reasons. It can't be undersold that the delayed reaction to the Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor killings dovetailed with the anger over Floyd's death about 2 weeks before an Atlanta policeman killed Rayshard Brooks. The confluence of the four killings served to underline problems with racial and police violence." Floyd's death sparked a national conversation on police reform. Many on the left wanted to defund the police, a slogan that supports reallocating funds from police departments to other local government agencies. For many on the right, this was a bridge too far, especially in light of the violence erupting in the streets. The debate over police reform and the unrest in the streets would cast a shadow over both the Democratic and Republican national conventions. If Joe Biden hoped to unite the country behind his candidacy, he would first have to unite a divided Democratic Party behind his nomination. Back in March, Biden had promised to pick a woman to be vice president. In August of 2020, Biden made good on his words.
Breaking news, Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden has made his choice. NBC News has confirmed that Biden has picked California Senator Kamala Harris to be his running mate.
Senator Kamala Harris, a former prosecutor, had been a vocal critic of Biden's record during the primary, especially at the first Democratic debate when she took Biden to task over the issue of busing. But in spite of their clashes on the debate stage, or perhaps because of them, Biden chose Harris as his running mate in what the New York Times called a sign of how the former vice president, who is oriented towards seeking consensus and building broad coalitions, might be expected to govern. Due to the novel coronavirus crisis, both the Democratic and Republican conventions had been postponed to August, and both would be conducted virtually. While Biden promised to build back better and win the battle for the soul of America, Donald Trump vowed to keep America great. At their convention, for the first time in its 160-year history, the GOP did not adopt an official party platform. Instead, the party pledged to enthusiastically support the president's America First agenda. The Republican convention was, as the Associated Press described it, filled with dark warnings about America's future if President Donald Trump fails to win a second term. And then, in his speech on the final night of the convention, Trump continued to rail against his opponent.
Joe Biden is not a savior of America's soul. He is the destroyer of America's jobs, and if given the chance, he will be the destroyer of American greatness.
Throughout the contest, the Trump campaign had released ads attacking Biden on a number of fronts, from his son Hunter's business dealings to Biden's past. Back in 1987, Biden had withdrawn from the 1988 presidential campaign over charges of plagiarism. Additionally, the Trump campaign went after Biden over a sexual assault allegation. NBC News reported Biden has landed in hot water over allegations of sexual assault from former Senate staffer Tara Reade in 1993. Although Trump himself has refrained from attacking his rival over the accusations, his campaign has aggressively highlighted them to embarrass Biden. Biden continually denied any wrongdoing, as did Trump, who had faced accusations of sexual misconduct from over 24 women. But prior to the pandemic, for many Americans, the defining question of the election had been the economy. The president had repeatedly called the Trump economy the greatest in history, and he had often claimed Biden would ruin it with higher taxes. During Trump's time in office, job growth had remained steady, and unemployment had been on the decline. But the stock market was arguably his crown jewel, as it had been from day one. As Reuters reported, hours after Trump's unexpected win on November 8, 2016, expectations of massive tax cuts and financial deregulation kicked off a stock rally that saw the S&P 500 surge 5% in a month. Wall Street continued its path higher through a trade war and impeachment, going on to new record highs. But that all changed with COVID-19. The pandemic was perhaps the biggest threat to a second term for Donald Trump and his economic nationalism. Since the start of the outbreak, Biden had largely restricted his campaign travel and avoided large in-person gatherings. He had been critical of Trump's aggressive campaign rally, saying, "Look what happened with his events. People die, people get together, they don't wear masks, they end up getting COVID." Biden pledged that his campaign, like his presidency, would always follow the science. But Trump accused Biden of hiding, saying, "It's time for him to step out of his own bunker, take a look around at the consequences of his words." But in the fall of 2020, it would be Trump and not Biden who would be confronted with the consequences of his words. On September 9th, PBS reported, "A new book by legendary journalist Bob Woodward has sent shockwaves across the country and the 2020 presidential campaign." Woodward's reporting includes audio recordings of the on-the-record conversations with President Trump in which he admits he intentionally misled Americans about the danger posed by the novel coronavirus.
Well, I think, Bob, really, to be honest with you,
Sure, I want you to.
I wanted to always play it down. I still like playing it down.
Yes,
because I don't want to create a panic.
The Woodward audio dominated the news cycle as the death toll in the U.S. surpassed 194,000, until mid-September, when another tragedy occurred. On September 18, 2020, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the liberal Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, passed away at the age of 87. Days before her death, Ginsburg told her granddaughter, "My most fervent wish is that I will not be replaced until a new president is installed." But the Senate Republicans did not wait. On the day of her death, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell released a statement reading in part, "President Trump's nominee will receive a vote on the floor of the United States Senate." Many Democrats cried foul at what they saw as the hypocrisy of Republicans changing their stance on nominating a justice in an election year. But Republicans believed the circumstances were not comparable. In 2016, the Democrats had control of the White House, but not the Senate. In 2020, the Republicans controlled both, and thus had a clear mandate to act, they claimed. Trump and the Senate would quickly move to confirm a nominee. But this decision would have unintended consequences that would upend the 2020 election and put the president and many of his closest advisors in harm's way. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free, like Wild West Extravaganza, a journey back to the fascinating, tumultuous, and often violent world of the American Old West. From famous outlaws like Billy the Kid and Jesse James, to lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok, to trailblazing pioneers and frontiersmen, Wild West Extravaganza tells the true stories of the real-life characters who shaped this iconic era. So saddle up and discover the true history of the American frontier, the good, the bad, and the ugly, ad-free at intohistory.com. Icebergs, jagged rocks and rocky straits, mutinies, misfortune, and broadside battles. There are more tales of the sea than survivors to tell them, but the podcast Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is doing a good job, and you can listen to all episodes of that podcast plus many others, including American Elections Wicked Game, without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is one of my favorites from last year, a podcast about the greatest mishaps, misfortune, and misadventures of the sea. You'll hear stories of corruption, greed, bad intentions, and just plain horrible decision-making that resulted in some of the worst maritime disasters from all over the world. And some of these are more recent than you think. All episodes are ad-free, including bonus content and more at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. It's September 29th, 2020. A small audience is gathered inside the Sampson Pavilion in Cleveland, Ohio. The cameras are rolling, and the political event that many pundits have likened to the Super Bowl is now underway.
Good evening from the Health Education Campus of Case Western Reserve University and the Cleveland Clinic. I'm Chris Wallace of Fox News, and I welcome you to the first of the 2020 presidential debates between President Donald J. Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden.
Wallace quickly explains the rules of the debate. 6 roughly 15-minute segments with 2-minute answers from each candidate to the first question, then open discussion for the rest of each segment. But 17 minutes into the conversation, after a myriad of arguments and interruptions, The rules go out the window completely when Wallace asks a tough question.
Mr. Vice President, if Senate Republicans, we were talking originally about the Supreme Court here, if Senate Republicans go ahead and confirm Justice Barrett, there has been talk about ending the filibuster or even packing the court, adding to the 9 justices there. You call this a distraction by the president, but in fact, it wasn't brought up by the president. It was brought up by some of your Democratic colleagues in the Congress.
3 days ago, President Trump nominated Amy Coney Barrett, a conservative jurist, lawyer, and former academic, to the Supreme Court. Many Democrats cried foul, calling the Republicans hypocrites to try and install a justice in an election year. Many went further and suggested that in retaliation, a President Biden would have the right to expand the size of the court and pack it with liberal judges. Biden has been cagey with his opinion, so Wallace presses the issue.
So my question to you is, you have refused in the past to talk about it. Are you willing to tell the American people tonight whether or not you will support either ending the filibuster or packing the court?
Whatever position I take on that, that'll become the issue. The issue is the American people should speak. You should go out and vote. You're in voting now.
But Trump isn't satisfied with this answer, and so he presses the question.
Vote and let your senators know how strongly you feel. Vote now.
Are you going to pack the
Make
court?
sure you, in fact, let people know
He doesn't want
you're a
to answer the
senator.
question.
I'm not going to answer the question
Why
because
wouldn't you answer that
because
question?
the question
You want to
is
put a lot of
the
new
question
Supreme Court
is
justices,
the
radical
question,
left.
Will you
Who
shut
is
up,
on,
man?
listen,
Chris Wallace does his best to restore order, but it's no use.
who is on your list, Joe?
This
Who's
is
on your
so
list?
right.
Gentlemen, I think
This
we've
is
ended
so
this.
He's going to pack the
unprecedented.
court.
We have
We're not going to give a list.
We have ended this segment. We're going to move on to the second segment.
That was really a productive segment, wasn't it?
Despite Wallace's best efforts, the evening quickly devolved. NPR's Domenico Montanaro called the first debate the worst in presidential history, writing, "If this was supposed to be a boxing match, it instead turned into President Trump jumping on the ropes, refusing to come down, the referee trying to coax him off, and Joe Biden standing in the middle of the ring with his gloves on and a confused look on his face." But there was also drama in the audience, too. Strict safety protocols have been put in place to protect the small crowd in attendance. But as the Washington Post reported on October 2nd, First Lady Melania Trump, as well as the president's sons, daughters, and several guests, violated safety protocols by taking off their masks after being seated. When debate officials offered them masks to wear, Trump's guests waved them off. On October 2nd, days after the debate, Trump announced on Twitter that he and his wife, First Lady Melania Trump, had both tested positive for the virus that causes COVID-19. Later that day, Trump was moved to the Walter Reed Military Hospital in Bethesda, Maryland. As Trump received treatment, including an experimental antibody drug, many in the media wondered when exactly the president had become infected. In an October interview with CBS News Radio, Dr. Anthony Fauci, the nation's leading disease expert, said, "Well, I think the data speaks for themselves. We had a super spreader event in the White House, and it was in a situation where people were crowded together and were not wearing masks." The super spreader event was Trump's Rose Garden ceremony announcing his Supreme Court nominee, Amy Coney Barrett. More than 150 guests attended. Many did not wear masks or practice social distancing. In addition to the president and the first lady, several attendees ended up testing positive, among them Republican Senators Tom Tillis of North Carolina and Mike Lee of Utah, former Trump spokeswoman Kellyanne Conway, and former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie. Trump's recovery was quick. By October 5th, he was back at the White House telling the American people not to fear COVID-19 and to get out there. But the Commission on Presidential Debates was more cautious, and on October 8th, they changed the second debate from a town hall to a virtual format. In response, the Trump campaign released a statement. President Trump won the first debate despite a terrible and biased moderator in Chris Wallace, and everybody knows it. For the swamp creatures at the Presidential Debate Commission to now rush to Joe Biden's defense by unilaterally canceling an in-person debate is pathetic. We'll pass on this sad excuse to bail out Joe Biden and do a rally instead. Trump's COVID-19 diagnosis was not the only surprise October had in store. On October 14th, the New York Post published a story that claimed Hunter Biden introduced his father, then Vice President Joe Biden, to a top executive at a Ukrainian energy firm less than a year before the elder Biden pressured government officials in Ukraine into firing a prosecutor who was investigating the company, according to emails obtained by the Post. The Post further asserted, the blockbuster correspondence, which flies in the face of Joe Biden's claim that he never spoke to his son about his overseas business dealings, is contained in a massive trove of data recovered from a laptop computer. But to many skeptics in the media, the New York Post article was dubious, in no small part because of its origin. The story had come from two Trump loyalists, former Trump advisor Steve Bannon and Trump's personal lawyer Rudy Giuliani. As Thomas Rid wrote in the Washington Post, Giuliani had been actively searching for dirt on Hunter Biden on trips to Ukraine, practically advertising his willingness to become a useful idiot on unknown terrain, exposed to some of the world's most aggressive and sophisticated intelligence services. And indeed, on one trip to Ukraine in December of 2019, Giuliani had interacted with individuals tied to Russian intelligence. Those interactions had reportedly caused U.S. counterintelligence officials to warn the White House that Giuliani was at risk of becoming a vessel for Russian disinformation. The Washington Post wasn't the only newspaper skeptical of the laptop story. Giuliani had shot the story to at least two conservative media outlets, Fox News and the Wall Street Journal. Both had passed. Even the New York Post ran into issues in its own newsroom. According to reporting by the New York Times, the New York Post's front-page article about Hunter Biden on Wednesday was written mostly by a staff reporter who refused to put his name on it. But it was this story that Trump hoped to make the focus of the last presidential debate on Thursday, October 22nd, at Nashville's Belmont University. As NBC News reported, as part of that strategy, Trump's guest list includes Tony Bobulinski, the former Hunter Biden business partner who told the New York Post that Joe Biden was in line to take a cut of a Chinese business deal negotiated by his son Hunter in early 2017. But Trump's plan was complicated by rule changes put into effect by the Commission on Presidential Debates. According to the new rules, if either candidate continually interrupted the other, their microphone would be cut off. At the time of the debate, COVID-19 cases were on the rise. But on the debate stage, Trump downplayed the situation, saying, "We're rounding the corner. It's going away." Though Trump did not offer a guarantee, he claimed that a coronavirus vaccine was weeks away. Biden, on the other hand, told Americans watching at home to prepare for a dark winter. Biden attacked Trump for blaming Democratic governors for the spread of the virus, and he tried to set himself apart from Trump, saying, "I don't look at this the way he does. Blue states and red states. They're all the United States." After the final debate, a BBC poll had Biden ahead nationally by 8 points, well outside the margin of error. But as the BBC reported, national polls are a good guide as to how popular a candidate is across the country, but they're not necessarily a good way to predict the result. In the 2016 election, Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton had been consistently ahead in the national polls, and even though she won the popular vote by 3 million, she lost the Electoral College to Donald Trump. This fact made many Americans skeptical of the polls, and it gave news organizations a cautious posture going into Election Day. Most experts agreed that the 2020 presidential election would be won or lost in the Rust Belt, the key battleground states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Additionally, there were other states believed to be in play that had gone to Trump in the 2016 election, most notably North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. But in an unprecedented election, there were unprecedented factors, especially the complicated issue of mail-in ballots. Due to the pandemic, more than 100 million ballots were cast before Election Day, well over twice the number from 2016. Since the beginning of the pandemic, Trump had suggested that mail-in voting would result in a corrupt election. At the first presidential debate, as ABC News reported, Trump had repeatedly posited a doomsday scenario with wide-scale fraud because of the expected increase in mail-in voting amid the coronavirus pandemic, but he provided no evidence to back up his frightening theory. Then on Election Day, Tuesday, November 3rd, the issue of mail-in ballots was front and center. As the New York Times reported, the counting is underway, but there are major differences among battleground states in how that plays out, and potential legal challenges, particularly from the Trump campaign, are likely to further complicate the process. On election night, the outcome was unclear. As the AP wrote, for weeks, media outlets warned a frazzled nation that it would have to be patient waiting for a decision. That's one prediction that turned out to be true. The 2020 polls had consistently predicted a Biden landslide. And like they had been in the 2016 contest, the polls were wrong again. Democrats had hoped to take back Florida, a state that had voted for Obama twice before going for Trump in 2016. And early on, Biden was in the lead. But by the end of election night, Trump had closed the gap, and the major news outlets called Florida for Trump. The state of Florida allowed its counties to process mail-in ballots, which tend to favor Democratic candidates, weeks before Election Day. Biden's early lead in Florida, bolstered by those mail-in ballots, was overwhelmed by in-person voting, which favored Donald Trump. But not all states allowed early processing. In many key battleground states, mail-in ballots were counted after the in-person votes. Newscasters had been aware of this information for weeks, and they had also been aware that early ballots tend to favor Democratic candidates, especially in the middle of the pandemic. But as the Washington Post would later report, the election night coverage was piecemeal reporting that created a whipsaw effect. Trump supporters went to bed late Tuesday believing he had won and woke up stunned to find Biden headed toward victory. The unprecedented volume of mail-in ballots affected both campaigns in different states and in different ways. Biden lost early leads in states like Florida, Ohio, and North Carolina as day-of in-person votes were counted after mail-in votes. Conversely, Trump surged ahead in the Rust Belt, but the red mirage faded, and Biden closed the gap as the mail-in ballots were counted. On November 4th, Biden was declared the winner in Michigan and Wisconsin by major media outlets. But minutes later, Trump sent out a series of tweets claiming victory in Michigan, as well as Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. He also cited a debunked report about ballot dumping in Michigan. Twitter immediately flagged the tweets with a warning label. Some or all of the content shared in this tweet is disputed and might be misleading about an election or other civic process. By November 5th, Trump's massive election night lead of 700,000 in Pennsylvania had dwindled to only 18,000 votes, as the number of virus-driven mail-in ballots overwhelmed his lead. With nearly 163,000 ballots left to be counted, Biden only needed 60% of those remaining to win the state and the election. With Michigan and Wisconsin in his columns, Pennsylvania would be enough to give Biden the 270 electoral votes required to win. And there was another state within Biden's grasp, one the Biden campaign was not expecting. As AP News reported the day after the election, the president's team was angry at Fox News for striking out ahead of other news organizations in declaring that Biden had defeated Trump in the battleground state of Arizona. It would have been the first state to flip parties from 2016 and was crucial in the path to 270 electoral votes for Trump. To defend this decision, Fox News anchor Bret Baier put the chief of the Fox decision desk on air. The chief explained that the bulk of uncounted votes in Arizona were cast early, and thus were statistically likely to go to Biden. Trump, the chief maintained, would not be able to catch up in Arizona. The varying ways in which the mail-in ballots impacted the individual states produced a backlash from Trump supporters. In Michigan, Trump supporters chanted, "Stop the count," but in Arizona, they chanted, "Count the votes," and in Pennsylvania, the chant was, "Stop the steal." The Trump team was also angry that Fox News had not called the state of Georgia for Trump. At the end of election night, Trump was ahead, but as CNBC reported on November 7th, Trump's lead in Georgia narrowed to just 463 votes, with 99% of total estimated votes counted. So with the balance of the election tipping toward Biden, the Trump campaign prepared to take the fight to the courts with a flurry of legal actions in multiple states, including Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. But on the morning of Saturday, November 7th, nearly 4 days after the final votes were cast, the major news networks called the election for Joe Biden. And on the evening of that same day, in front of a socially distanced crowd of supporters in Delaware, Biden jogged onto stage, took the podium, and addressed the American people.
Folks, the people of this nation have spoken. They've delivered us a clear victory, a convincing victory, a victory for we the people. We've won with the most votes ever cast on a presidential ticket in the history of the nation. 74 million.
Biden thanked his family and his wife, the soon-to-be First Lady Jill Biden, and he thanked his running mate.
And I'll have the honor of serving with the fantastic Vice President who you just heard from, Kamala Harris, who makes history as the first woman, first black woman, the first woman from South Asian descent, the first daughter of an immigrant ever elected in this country. Don't tell me it's not possible in the United States. It's long overdue. I'm proud of the coalition we put together, the broadest and most diverse coalition in history. Democrats, Republicans, independents, progressives, moderates, conservatives, young, old, urban and suburban, rural, gay, straight, transgender, white, Latino, Asian, Native American. I mean it, especially those moments. And especially for those moments where this campaign was at its lowest ebb, the African-American community stood up again for me. You've always had my back, and I'll have yours.
Then Biden reiterated a familiar theme.
I've long talked about the battle for the soul of America. We must restore the soul of America. Our nation is shaped by the constant battle between our better angels and our darkest impulses. And what presidents say in this battle matters. It's time for our better angels to prevail.
Biden declared victory, but Trump refused to concede. In the weeks to come, Trump continued to use the pulpit of his office and social media to sow doubts about the outcome. Many of his tweets falsely claimed victory, election fraud, or promoted debunked conspiracy theories. Twitter moved to label many of them as disputed or with links to properly reported election results, but the repeated accusations of fraud gained momentum, allowing Trump-aligned political action committees to raise over $200 million from devoted supporters hoping for a different result. And with the help of a legal team led by former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani, Trump launched an aggressive legal battle to overturn the results of the election. Trump and other Republicans filed dozens of lawsuits across the country. Courts denied or dismissed most, with others withdrawn. Then, on Tuesday, December 8th, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton seized on the potential of the U.S. Supreme Court's original jurisdiction of mediating disputes between states to file a suit directly to the highest court. It was perhaps the last day legal action could be considered. December 8th was also the so-called safe harbor deadline. Established by the Electoral Count Act of 1887, the safe harbor deadline is the date by which all state-level election challenges must be complete. As the New York Times explained, after the deadline, state courts would most likely have to throw out any new lawsuit challenging the election. Additionally, after the safe harbor deadline, all certified election results are considered final, and those states' electoral college votes must be counted by Congress. At the time of the safe harbor deadline, Biden had secured more than the 270 electoral votes required to become president. Attorney General Paxton's lawsuit was viewed by many Trump supporters as their last best hope. Trump himself had predicted, "I think this election will end up in the Supreme Court." Legal scholars, though, called the case outlandish and a press release masquerading as a lawsuit. But 17 other states filed amicus briefs, and over 100 Republican House members did the same, adding their voice in support of the appeal to the courts to overturn the election's results. But on Friday, December 11th, in a terse, unsigned order, the Supreme Court rejected the Texas lawsuit, writing, "The state of Texas's motion for leave to file a bill of complaint is denied for lack of standing under Article 3 of the Constitution. Texas has not demonstrated a judicially cognizable interest in the manner in which another state conducts its elections. All other pending motions are dismissed as moot." After hearing the news, Trump went to Twitter to vent his frustrations. "The Supreme Court really let us down. No wisdom, no courage. This is a great and disgraceful miscarriage of justice. The people of the United States were cheated and our country disgraced. Never even given our day in court." Then, in all caps and with triple exclamation marks, Trump tweeted, "We have just begun to fight." But on the Monday, after the second Wednesday in December, as required by federal law, electors from each state met to cast their votes for president. According to the Associated Press, as of Monday, December 14, 2020, Joe Biden won with 306 electoral votes to Donald Trump's 232. Biden won the popular vote by well over 7 million. Joe Biden's victory makes him America's 46th president, and it makes Trump only the third elected president since World War II to lose re-election after Jimmy Carter and George Herbert Walker Bush. Still, in the minds of many Americans, and apparently in the mind of Donald Trump, Biden's victory is still not certain. A CBS News poll released on December 13th showed that 62% of registered voters believe that the election is over and that it is time to move on. But 75% of Republicans said that they believe the election is not over and that it should still be contested. Just 18% of those who voted for Trump in 2020 said they consider Biden the legitimate winner. The answer to why this false notion can be held by so many is arguably information. Edwin Lingar, a columnist for the Reno Gazette-Journal, wrote, "Americans live in two alternate and competing realities. Democrats get information from social media, just like many Republicans. But when we do, it makes us all dumber, me included. Switching back and forth between news stations makes America look like two different, almost unrelated countries. Both sides went into the election expecting a blowout for their side, a red wave versus blue. At last, we might have one shared reality, disappointment." Molly Ball of Time touched on this sentiment too, writing, "The 2020 election did not go according to plan for the Democrats. It was a far cry from the sweeping repudiation of Trump that the polls had forecast and liberals craved. After all the outrage and activism, a projected $14 billion spent, and millions more votes this time than last, Trump's term is ending the way it began, with an election once again teetering on a knife's edge, and a nation entrenched in stalemate, torn between two realities, two orientations, two sets of facts." The 2020 election was arguably among the most divisive in American history. And though President Trump's refusal to concede the election is certainly unprecedented, it's also true that the wicked game of presidential elections is as American as the Founding Fathers themselves. In the run-up to the 1800 election, a John Adams supporter claimed Thomas Jefferson's presidency would usher in legal prostitution. A Jefferson supporter called Adams a hermaphrodite. Still, after a vicious campaign defined by partisan rancor, personal vitriol, and widespread fear of violence, and after a close, chaotic election decided weeks after the fact by the House of Representatives, the peaceful transfer of power occurred. In his inaugural message, newly elected President Thomas Jefferson struck a unifying tone, writing, "Let us then, fellow citizens, unite with one heart and one mind. Let us restore to social intercourse that harmony and affection without which liberty and even life itself are but dreary things. Every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. If there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this union or change its Republican form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated, where reason is left free to combat it." This is episode 59 of American Elections Wicked Game 2020, You're Fired. On the next episode, the election of 2024. In the wake of the infamous events of January 6th, former President Donald Trump fights through a sea of legal troubles to secure his party's nomination. But Trump's improbable rise is jeopardized when President Biden announces his intention to step aside and endorse his Vice President, Kamala Harris. Tired of ads and promos like these? Want to skip ahead to newer elections? You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. But not only that, you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free. That includes the American Revolution podcast, a deep and thorough investigation of the times, people, and politics behind America's fight for independence. Also, the battles, because we can't start a new American nation without guns. And the American Revolution podcast tells the story of the revolution from beginning to end, from its origins in the French and Indian War, through the war itself, and on to the founding of the United States. Get American Elections Wicked Game, the American Revolutions podcast, and many others ad-free with bonus content at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. This episode contains reenactments and dramatized details, and while in most cases we can't know exactly what was said, all our dramatizations are based on historical research. American Election's Wicked Game is an Airship production, hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsey Graham. Audio editing by Molly Bach. Sound design by Derek Behrens. Music by Lindsey Graham. Co-executive produced by Stephen Walters in association with Ritual Productions. Written and researched by Stephen Walters. Fact-checking by Greg Jackson and CL Salazar from the podcast History That Doesn't Suck.